good morning, everyone. My name is Dalia Simangan, Associate Professor here at Hiroshima University, and I will be your moderator today. Good morning to our on-site attendees, and hello to our online participants. This is the NERPS webinar series on peace and sustainability in the context of global change. This is a platform to feature leading voices in the practice and research on peace and sustainability. And today we're very fortunate to have one of those leading voices. Dr. Tobias Ide is an award-winning and internationally recognized university researcher and teacher in the fields of international relations, peace and conflict studies, and environmental research. His current work assesses how environmental stress and climate change interact with the dynamics of peace, conflict, and security, and how these intersecting challenges can be addressed. His new book, as you can see over here, Climate Catastrophes and Constraints, How Disasters Shape the Dynamics of Armed Conflicts, published last year by the MIT Press, bagged the International Science Prize on Peace and Ecology in the Anthropocene. Organizations like the EU, NATO, the World Bank, and the UN have recently drawn on insights from his work. And he will share one of his projects today, where he will tackle the question, how do conflict parties, particularly rebel groups, react if a disaster strikes a civil war zone? A truly interdisciplinary scholar, Dr. Ide holds PhDs in political science and earth science, and he is also an editor of the journal Environment and Security and the director of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. He will be with us on campus until the conclusion of the NERPS conference in March as a specially appointed professor at NERPS Hiroshima University. Colleagues, friends, join me in welcoming Dr. Tobias Ide.
Okay. The microphone seems to work, and now I have both hands busy with technical stuff. So welcome and good morning, everyone. Dalia, thanks a lot for the very kind introduction and for providing me the opportunity to be here at NERPS as a cross-appointed professor and learn from all the amazing work you're doing in this group and at this university. As already mentioned, my Dalia, the starting point for the research project, or basically two related research projects I'm presenting today, is or are disasters. And if you okay, if the PowerPoint would do what it's supposed to do, which it does now, fantastic. All right. So as you can see from the upper side of that slide here, that's a graph of disaster events, fatalities, and economic damage over the last 40 to 50 years. And as you can see, while there is a slight decline in fatalities, we see a tremendous increase in the number of disaster events and also in the economic damage done by disasters. And I'd argue that's not very surprising, given we have climate change, we have urbanization, but we also have persistent socioeconomic inequalities that render people vulnerable to disasters. And then on the other side, this is a graph from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, where you see the number of active armed conflicts worldwide since 1946. And what I found striking about this graph is that only 1 year until 2014 had more than 50 armed conflicts worldwide. This was 1991, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. But from 2015 onwards, every single year saw more than 50 armed conflicts active worldwide. So by historical standards, we're living in an historically war-prone or violent period, at least if we talk about civil wars within states. Now, if disasters are on the upward trends and if a civil war are on a record high, that means we can expect by sheer mathematics that disasters will more often strike civil war zones, armed conflict zones, even apart from all the fact that Civil wars destroy hospitals, streets, emergency services, and so on. So countries with a history of armed conflict are usually also much more vulnerable to disasters. And there's this big debate about climate change and conflict. There's a smaller debate about disasters and conflict, which connects to that because some of disasters like droughts, storms, or floods are, of course, closely tied to climate change. But a lot of this debate is actually focusing on armed conflict onset or incidents. And there's very little discussion about what actually happens if disasters strike areas with an active armed conflict. So if there's already a conflict going on and then a disaster strikes the area. So the main project I'm presenting today is addressing this very question: what happens if disasters strike armed conflict zones? And that is also what the book is about. And I won't talk too long about my methods. What I do, I integrate quantitative and qualitative data from 36 cases across 21 different countries from all different continents, as you can see on the map here. The main outcome of interest is armed conflict escalation or de-escalation, as indicated by an intensification of fighting or by less battles or less larger battles going on in an armed conflict zone. And well, I mean, the important thing to remember here is that, I mean, it's really important here to integrate quantitative and qualitative data. I will discuss that in a second, but there's really like on some variables, some conditions, we only have one kind of data or the other, and we would miss a large part of the picture if we wouldn't do that. I'm not going to bore you too much with my theory. But at least I need to show you one slide on the theory so you understand how I arrive at the results or how the results can be interpreted. So you see, I mean, you can't see it online, but you see on the top line, you see conflict escalation and de-escalation. As I said, these are the main outcomes of interest of the project. This is what I'm trying to explain. Obviously, there's also the possibility that disasters have no impact on conflict dynamics, but I don't feel that's something that needs to be explicitly explained. And then we have on the y-axis, if you want to say so, three common explanations for armed conflict dynamics or for why armed conflicts intensify or de-escalate. And this is motivation, strategy, and communication. And if you pair the two outcomes of interest with this three theoretical perspective, you arrive at 6 potential linkages or connections from disasters to conflict intensity. And the book has like a whole 30-page chapter on that, which is already as short as I could write it. I will explain it very briefly, mostly by giving you an example or two without, diving too much into the theory. That's all in the book, or you can ask questions if you're more interested in that. So if we pair motivation and conflict escalation, then we arrive at grievances. So we all know that disasters sometimes, so motivation basically refers to the motives of the people or the groups participating in an armed conflict. So disasters can lead to enormous grievances, usually but not always against the government. So people die and then they survive, or people lose their livelihoods, they get wounded, and they might blame the government for not doing enough to prepare for the disaster, not helping them. And if they feel there's no proper way to articulate their grievances peacefully, or there isn't already existing rebel groups that, offers them a way to articulate the grievances violently, they might do that. However, we know from a large literature in disaster sociology and disaster diplomacy that large-scale disasters also quite often lead to local level cooperation between groups that do not get along too well, because usually disaster is this big external threat that poses an immediate challenge, an immediate problem to several groups on the ground. So they need to put aside their differences and work together and create some solidarity to cope with the post-disaster situation, at least for the initial 6 months. But I'm mostly considering the 6 to 12 months after the disaster. So that's exactly the time frame. So if we follow that, we could also see a spike in post-disaster solidarity, which would lead to more cooperation. And then obviously less fighting, at least temporarily, between the conflict parties. Okay, strategy, the second perspective, moves away from the motivations of the conflict parties and focuses on the material strategic environment that the conflict parties face. And disasters offer quite a few opportunities for conflict parties. On the one hand, people might lose their livelihoods, they get deprived by the disaster, so they look for alternative income opportunities, which do not always need to be in the formal economy. It could, for instance, also be rebel groups paying a salary. Or the government, military paying a salary to the disaster survivors. So they can recruit more fighters and hence escalate the fighting. We can also think of situations where, for instance, the government moves into a rebel area to provide support for the disaster victims and is then attacked by the insurgents, and you see more fighting going on. But on the other hand, disasters can also pose massive constraints to the conflict parties. For instance, it's really hard to move your troops around if large areas of land are flooded or if key infrastructure like roads or bridges are destroyed by an earthquake. During a disaster period, also both the government, military, but also the rebels, especially if they have ties to the local population, are often expected to provide relief to the disaster survivors, which, I mean, drains their capacity to engage in fighting, in armed violence. Okay. Finally, the communication perspective basically assumes that violence, it's not just a physical act of hurting someone, but it can also be a very powerful way to send a message. And to give you a very specific example of that, assume that you're a rebel group and usually rebel groups depend on support of either some local populations or some external sponsors that provide them with money or weapons. Now there's a big disaster striking the area where the rebel group operates. And that could raise doubts among the civilian population or the external sponsors that rebel groups are still capable to continue the fighting, are still willing to continue the fighting. And as a rebel group, you don't want that, because if people doubt your ability or your determination to fight, they might not support you any longer. They shift their support to other rebel groups or other political parties. And that is bad for you. So what you could do as a rebel group is you could launch a message like a podcast or on your website or something and say, hey, we're still here, we're still ready to fight, we still have the capability, but everyone knows you could lie about that, right? I mean, it's not very, I mean, everyone knows you have an incentive to lie about that. But if you intensify your attacks after disaster, perhaps picking a few weak targets, civilian populations, remote police stations, and so on, you demonstrate credibly, you send a costly signal, because sending that signal costs you something. You show that you have the resources. But then on the other hand, both civilian population and a lot of the international community are not usually very happy if there's a big humanitarian emergency, and rather than supporting the emergency relief or engaging in relief efforts yourself, you cultivate the fight, you intensify the fighting. So even in situations where the rebels or the government have the incentive to intensify the fighting because they have the motives, they have the strategy, they might refrain from doing so because there's a lot of international and national attention on the disaster, and they want to portray themselves as the responsible, good guys you can trust, you can work with, who do not escalate the fighting in the wake of a big humanitarian emergency. All right, so 6 pathways connecting disasters to conflict dynamics. How do the empirics look like? So first of all, and I have to say it was random sampling. So I just looked for disasters that usually killed more than 1,000 people striking areas with an armed conflict zone. So it was more or less random sampling. the results look very symmetrical, which was not intentional. So in half of the cases of the 36, exactly 18, there's no change in conflict dynamics related to a disaster. And that's usually either because the disaster took too far away from the conflict zone, it did not affect the conflict parties, or there were other social and political and economic factors that were much more important or overshadowed the relevance of the disaster for the conflict dynamics. In 9 of the cases, so that's 25%, we saw a massive escalation of the fighting, usually more than 5 standard deviations compared to the average. And I think that is a good indicator that all these debates about climate change and security, climate change and conflict have a point, because if 1 out of 4 major disasters trigger a massive escalation of fighting, then obviously climate change increasing risks for droughts, floods, storms, and so on, means that climate change also is a risk factor for armed conflict and more for traditional understandings of security. However, in another quarter of all cases, we see a de-escalation of conflict after disasters. That is something that has been very rarely considered in the literature. Usually it's, do disasters, does climate change, does resource scarcity increase conflict risks, yes or no? And the third possibility, the de-escalation, is quite often ignored. And I would say that's not a good idea, because empirically it happens quite often that disasters lead to de-escalation of conflict. It's usually short-term, 6 to 12 months, but it provides a window of opportunity to kickstart diplomacy, to deliver relief, either related to the disaster or related to the conflict, and so on. So it's definitely something we should not ignore as scholars, but also not as practitioners. All right, which of the 6 pathways has the best explanatory power? And you can see that the strategy perspective trumps all the other perspectives by long shots. So opportunities are by far the most important factor explaining the escalation, constraints by far the most important factor explaining the de-escalation of conflict. Grievances and solidarity don't have much explanatory power. This is not because there are not massive grievances after disasters, and this is also not because there is no local solidarity after disasters, but these usually happen on the very local level, on the community level, and they usually do not scale up to more, let's say, high-level fighting dynamics between the rebel group and the government. On the communication perspective has pretty good explanatory power for conflict de-escalation, for the image cultivation pathway, and it has especially so after large-scale disasters like the 2005 earthquake in Pakistan or the 2008 cyclone Nargis in Myanmar. And I argue this is not particularly surprising, because the bigger a disaster is, the more international attention it will draw. And the more national attention it will draw. And the more attention is on the case, the higher is the incentive for the conflict parties to de-escalate the fighting, at least temporarily, to cultivate the image. So it's not really surprising. Okay, the book also, and the project also tried to answer the question, why do some of the outcomes happen and under which circumstances? So why do we sometimes see escalation? Why do we sometimes see de-escalation? What are the factors? And in order to illustrate this is exactly the same graph you saw on the previous slide, just on a more arrowy way, if you want to say so. So you have the 18 cases of impact, no impact, and then 9 cases of escalation, de-escalation. Now, what factors shape whether a case takes one trajectory or the other? Well, disasters have an impact on conflict dynamics if 2 conditions are present. The first one is the society is vulnerable to disasters. This is not largely surprising, because disasters are rarely the main drivers of conflict dynamics. They are usually overshadowed by political or economic factors. So in order for disasters to shape armed conflict dynamics, they need to have far-reaching societal impacts, and they usually do that if societies are highly vulnerable to disasters. And of course, they need to affect at least one conflict party in a significant positive or negative way, providing opportunities or constraints, because if it doesn't do that, well, the conflict party does not really have an incentive to change its fighting dynamics. Why do we see an escalation? We usually see an escalation if the disaster benefits one conflict party. In the sample of the book, the disaster always benefited the rebels relative to the government. So the government was busy with the disaster response. The government had limited income from the disaster affected area, needed to deploy security forces there, and the rebels could probably sometimes recruit more fighters, and then they could escalate the fighting. So the disaster benefits one conflict party. I mean, out of the sample, there are cases like the 2022 floods in Nigeria where the disaster benefited the government over the rebels. But based on the sample I work with, that's probably less common. There is a secondary pathway where there's significant local grievances related to the disasters, and the rebels exploit them and act upon them, but that's empirically of lesser relevance. And disasters de-escalate conflict dynamics or armed conflicts if one conflict party is weakened by the disaster, either the government or the rebels, and the other conflict party is unable to exploit that, either because it is also weakened by the disaster, or the government has no presence in the area, or the rebels are small and weak and cannot stage additional attacks on the government, at least not in the disaster-affected area. And that's a major insight because a lot of the literature that exists on disasters, on climate, on conflict risks focuses a lot on, I would say, factors that slowly change over time. The nature of the political system, the exclusion of ethnic groups, the agricultural dependence, the economic strength of a country, which obviously changes, but very slowly over time. It's more or less constant in short amounts of time. But what I show here is that basically how the disaster affects specific conflict parties within the very first weeks and months, that are the main factors in explaining what happens with the conflict. So we need to focus much more on these short-term and local factors because they are the main drivers of conflict escalation or de-escalation after disaster. Okay, give you two very brief examples to make this less abstract. So Sri Lanka, 2004 tsunami, the big Indian Ocean tsunami, killed over 35,000 people. And happened during a time when the government was fighting a fierce civil war against the LTTE insurgents for almost 3 decades at that point, which was a bit of a cool down stage, and there was a peace process that was at the brink of failure, however. And then the disaster basically had two impacts. The first one was that there was a large political fallout between the government and the rebels about the distribution of the aid, because the LTTE, the Tamil Tiger rebels, controlled large parts of land in the north and eastern part of Sri Lanka, which, as you can see, was severely affected by the tsunami. The government obviously wanted to deliver aid there because they didn't want the rebels to take credit for it. They want to win the hearts and minds of the people. But the LTTE said, no, you're going to spy on us. You're going to, like make political propaganda. We are not going to allow that. But the government obviously was also not happy with the LTTE delivering the international aid in the area because they said, we are the government and we don't want you to benefit from delivering the aid. So there was a big political fallout. Aid arrived relatively late, international aid, leading to massive grievances on the ground. The other thing was that both parties thought the other side would be weakened by the disaster. The LTTE thought, oh, the government, like there's this massive disaster all across the country. The military is heavily involved. The government must be weakened. The government thought, oh, the north and eastern part is so heavily affected. A lot of the LTTE bases are close to the coast. They must be heavily affected. Both were affected, but not as heavily as the other side thought. So both parties concluded that if you stage some military offensives now, you can easily win some land, put military pressure, and then improve your position in the negotiations. But if both parties do that, obviously, you have a massive escalation of the conflict. Pakistan, after the 2010 flooding, is the contrary example. There were a lot of concerns that the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP, that were mostly active in the northern areas, that they would exploit the floods to extend their operations to gain territory. But the opposite was the case. In the 12 months after the disaster, we see more than 50% reduction of casualties and battles related to fighting. And one of the reasons for that is that, I mean, there was already a lot of heavy fighting in 2007-8 that sort of weakened the Taliban a bit. So the conflict has cooled down. But there was also that both sides were heavily constrained in their abilities to continue the fighting. For the government, it was very busy with the disaster response. 20% of Pakistan's land area were underwater, so the military was heavily involved in evacuation and relief efforts. So they lacked the manpower, and also there's not a lot of streets going to the north, and a lot of them were flooded. So for a major military operation, bringing in all the soldiers and equipment by helicopters is sort of difficult to do. The Taliban, on the other side, first of all, in order to finance their insurgency, they heavily taxed and forced contributions from the local economy. But if there's a lot of flood damage, obviously you cannot tax people that much without causing protests. Also, the Taliban had pretty close relationships or ties with the local population. So it was really hard for them to decline relief. They were massive relief providers, but obviously if you send fighters to areas to provide disaster relief, it's really hard to continue military offensives. So the conflict de-escalated. If you want to read more on that, there's the book, which you can of course buy, but which you can also download as an open access from the MIT Press Direct website. If you don't have the time to read the whole book, I also summarized the main points of the research project in an international security article that came also out last year that is also open access, and you can download from the link. All right. I will spend the remaining few minutes to talk about the follow-up project. So something that I already pitched or mentioned during these past cases is that rebels usually are involved in reacting to the disaster, both militarily, but also in providing relief to the local population. And that is something of what we in the peace and conflict literature call rebel governance. So rebel governance are institutionalized modes of social coordination to produce and implement collectively binding rules or to provide collective goods and services like disaster preparation and disaster response. And rebels, just as other non-state actors like NGOs, armed militias, warlords, companies, private security companies are often involved in these kind of governance action. So rebel rule is quite widespread. Over 60 million people globally live in areas that are solely controlled by rebel groups, and several, like more than 100 million people live in areas where the rebels have at least some degree of control, probably several hundred million. So the project focuses on the Communist Party of Nepal, the Communist Party of the Philippines, and the FARC in Colombia to study their strategies of dealing with disasters. And I traveled already to Nepal and Philippines to do interviews with former combatants and ask them about their experiences with disasters and about what they did, how they governed, how they interacted with the population after disasters. And to just provide a few brief insights on that. I mean, I just started the analysis, so it's really early stage. But to show you a few preliminary insights. So first of all, rebel groups are major providers of disaster relief. They usually evacuate population, they distribute food, tents, they help to repair bridges, clean out roads after landslide, and so on. And they particularly do so in areas that are remote, where the government has very low presence. Because first of all, they can operate there relatively safe, but that's also where they can gain a lot from the disaster response because the government cannot really provide something to the local population. They are particularly active in areas that they also control territorially. Even so, especially groups like the National People's Army in Nepal also moved around with these mobile squads and provided help on the spot in areas where the government had a stronger presence. They have different degrees of organization. So, for instance, the National People's Army in Nepal more or less reacted spontaneously to disasters. Sorry, not the National People's Army, the People's Liberation Army. Why the National People's Army, the New People's Army in the Philippines, together with the Communist Party, have an elaborate network of front organizations, so legal civil society organizations that channel money from international donors to the local communities while doing outreach and support tasks for the communist insurgency. So, which is much more organized. But in both cases, the rebel groups significantly benefit from the disaster response because they gain a lot of credibility and support from the local organizations. And in the case of the Philippines, they are also able to keep some of the international relief coming in for their purposes. Rebels also engage in disaster preparation. For instance, sometimes they relocate people from disaster-prone areas. They limit logging on steep slopes or areas that are important for the hydrological cycle. They also sometimes do education activities, for instance, about floods, food storage, or disease prevention after disasters. Again, more organized in the Philippines than in Nepal. Rebels usually face much more limits on preparation because preparation is very resource intense and rebels rarely have that degree of resources. But preparation is also knowledge intensive. And for instance, the rebel groups in Nepal, they have very little knowledge of high altitude areas where landslides, glacier lake outbursts, or snowstorms affect the population, but they simply do not have the sufficient local knowledge to know how to act on those risks. Yeah, so that are the limitations. All right, I have 1 more minute, so I better come to my key takeaway points. So first of all, disaster conflict links are non-deterministic. Disasters can contribute to conflict escalation, de-escalation, or have no impact. And most importantly, they are multi-directional. They do not always contribute to escalation. They can also provide opportunities for diplomacy, for aid delivery when they facilitate armed conflict de-escalation. The strategy, and at least for conflict de-escalation, the communication perspectives are the key causal mechanisms. So these are the pathways connecting disasters to higher or lower conflict risks. And finally, rebel groups' disaster governance cannot be ignored because rebel groups are very active and they control large amounts of territories and populations in several civil war-ridden countries, including areas which are very disaster prone. So ignoring the contribution rebels or other non-state actors make to disaster relief and risk preparation it will not help us to increase disaster risk reduction or to conduct disaster risk reduction activities, which is crucially dependent on working with a broad range of stakeholders, whether we agree on with their political and, well, let's say physical activities or not. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the debate and the Q&A.
Thank you, Tobias. Wow, what an amazing work of really packing in 30 minutes all this information and details about this complex, and as you said, also non-deterministic and multiple pathways that link armed conflicts and disasters. Quite alarming coming from the Philippines that, rebel groups can take advantage of disasters to enhance their legitimacy and gain support that could, later on influence in the outcomes of armed conflicts. But really fascinating research. And as a member of NERPS, we really look forward to learning more about your project for the next 2 years. And we hope that from the room and also from our online participants, if you'd like to collaborate and, just learn more about this project, feel free to connect with Dr. Tobias Ide. All right, so we'll have questions for our online participants. I know that some of you already logged in your questions. If you'd like to ask your question directly, you can use the raise hand function, and then we're gonna call your name, and then we will unmute you so you can ask the question directly. And for our, of course, on-site participants, feel free to just raise your hand, your physical hand, and ask your questions or just share your comments and reflections. We have several participants here who are coming from this case studies that you have visited or studied. Thank you.
Good morning, Doctor. I'm Gayan Kahanraj from Sri Lanka, first day for doctoral student. Thank you very much for your presentation. I do agree with you all the key takeaways since I know very much about this incident with regard to, especially with regard to Sri Lanka. During the conflict, 2004 tsunami, actually, most of the northern eastern parts of the country was under the control of the rebels. However, as you correctly mentioned, the rebel areas as well as the government controlled military assets were badly affected due to the conflict. However, being a legitimate military forces, we were able to recover our resources so quickly with the international aid, but LTD didn't had such an opportunity, so they were badly affected. However, during that time, the ceasefire agreement was on progress, so we didn't the conflict didn't escalated. And also LTT has negotiated a lot with the Sri Lankan government forces to get the support of the foreign aids, because they didn't had any access for the foreign aid. As well as that, the government also had to negotiate with the rebels, since we didn't had complete access to provide welfare measures to the affected people. Thank you very much for your insights.
Yeah, I think that are a few good points. And I agree with basically all of them. I'm happy to jump on. So I think what played a factor in the LGTE recovering more quickly than many experts would have expected was their diaspora networks. So as you would know, they had very elaborated schemes to gain funding from well, basically Tamils abroad. So I think that certainly played a role. And then, I mean, obviously, I had 2 minutes for the case, so I could talk about it. Actually, the government negotiated an agreement with the LTTE about the distribution of aid, but then it was challenged by the opposition in the High Court, and then obviously it failed, and that was also part of the fallout. So there's a bit more nuanced story, but I hope you can bear with me for like condensing it to 2 minutes. And I mean, what you can see in the Sri Lankan case, where do we have it here? So, I mean, you could see that the ceasefire agreement was in place because you had these small bumps of fighting here and there. But then you basically see, and then you had the immediate disaster, and then you see the bumps are getting a bit bigger here. And then all of a sudden you see escalation to like at the, 11 months mark. So you clearly see it comes from a relatively low level because the peace negotiations were going on. And then after the disaster, you really see that spike. So yeah, thanks a lot for adding on that. That's super helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Professor. My name is Fari Boydibekzoda. I'm a second-year master student from Hiroshima University, and I'm from Tajikistan. So I saw on your first slide when you're showing the conflicts, right, that were in your case study. I more wonder, can you elaborate more on Tajikistan? Because of course we had conflict in 1992 that lasted for 5 years, but we never, at least me, I never saw how the disaster affected on it. So can you elaborate more on this?
Yes, very happy to. The only thing is, I think Tajikistan was one of the very first cases I examined. So it's 4 years ago that I did the work on Tajikistan. So please bear with me if my memory of the case is not the best. There's like a 2-3 page summary in the book if you're more interested. But I mean, from memory, what happened in Tajikistan was, I mean, you had a transition after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and then you had the formation of a pretty strong opposition to the government, which erupted in the civil war. And I think in the formative days of the civil war, you had large flooding in the areas where that were more or less opposition strongholds or leaning towards the opposition. So there are reports that the opposition forces use that to tell the population that, look, these big floods happen and the government does nothing. So that shows you they really don't care about you. And second of all, that they use that as a tool to recruit more followers, either by propaganda, telling the people that, or by offering them some material compensation to join the rebellion. However, I think Tajikistan is one of the cases where the link, even so there's evidence for it, is relatively weak, because obviously the political fallout between the government and the opposition just a few weeks before, and the demonstrations were the main drivers of the conflict onset and escalation.
Thank you. Let me pick up some of the questions from our online participants.
Very happy to.
Right. This just seeing all these graphs, the spikes in the escalation. There's this one question, however, that's related to the cases without change. So Mary Donna Ang asks, she wanted to ask the question directly, but she has a flu. But she thanks you for the very well explained study, and she wants to ask about this no change scenario. How can a disaster not produce any change on conflict? And can you explain more on this subset of your sample?
Yes. So first of all, Marie, I hope you get well soon. Flu is nothing to joke with. But I mean, I think the best case of this is an earthquake that happened in Russia in 1995 in an island in the very remote east of Russia. So basically very close to Japan, where we are now, actually. And at that time, Russia was fighting a major civil war in Chechnya, which from memory is roughly 4,000 kilometers from the island. So, of course, the Russian state had to respond to that major earthquake, because I think 2,000 people were killed. Basically, the whole island was destroyed. Like, there were barely any houses standing. But they could mostly do that with the forces and the resources they had in the Far East, and that in no way influenced their fighting in the Chechen area. And you have quite a few examples like that. It's not always that they are geographically that far away, but you have quite a few cases where the rebels and the government are simply not affected. I think the unique strengths of the approach I'm doing is I do like the graphs you see. I mean, these are battle-related deaths. These are quantitative data. You can download them. You can produce the graphs. But for each of the cases, I check that with other quantitative data on the number of battles and also the number of violent events from another data set, ACLED. And then I also always dived into the literature to check A, whether the quantitative data represent what really happened on the ground, and B, if there was a change in conflict dynamics, whether it was tied to the disaster or not. Good example of that is, I have problems finding my cases, Pakistan 2005, big earthquake in Balochistan, and after that, massive spike of the fighting. So barely, and you can see that across all quantitative data sets, that spike. Sometimes it's a bit steeper, sometimes it happens a bit earlier, but you see it across all that. So what happened was the government staged a military offensive against the Baluchi rebels in 2005. That was already planned months before the earthquake. It was postponed a few months because of the earthquake. But in no way, I mean, they already planned it. They already had the intention. They would have done it no matter whether the earthquake had happened or not. So you see the clear spike, but the quantitative data would be misleading because it's in no way related to the disaster. And actually, in 13 of the 36 cases, so more than 1/3 of the cases, using the quantitative data alone would have been misleading without having qualitative information on the ground, which also means we should be very careful in relying on our judgment simply on the quantitative statistical information without knowledge on the ground, because sometimes, as this example illustrates, there is a change in conflict dynamics, but it's simply not related to the disaster.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for reinforcing that, really the value of combining different methodologies, especially in these types of issues that are very complex and very dynamic. Another very good question we have from an online participant. And this is somehow related to my question also, if there are variations across the different types of disasters. And Danielle Garcia, our online participant, asks, does your research consider man-made ecological disasters such as rebel-owned illegal mining or petroleum extraction and its impact on conflict?
No, the research doesn't deal with man-made disasters. That would be another book or another study, which I would be very happy to do. But at the moment, you need to limit yourself to make it comparable, because I mean, if you kick in or if you bring in man-made disasters, obviously they're much stronger tied to political decisions, to existing grievances, perhaps already even more so to the conflict, because like large-scale illegal mining for minerals can happen more often in areas where there's limited government control, where rebels try to finance the insurgency and so on. So you have this whole issue of endogeneity, which I feel means you cannot compare these two types of disasters in a single study. However, yes, disaster types matter. I mean, the question is, do they matter or not? I have a backup slide on that because I get that question quite often. So I divided the disaster into slow onset disasters like droughts, mostly droughts, but also some floods that build up, because of rainfall over weeks and weeks, and then rapid onset disasters, particularly earthquakes, but also storms. And as you can see, the numbers, I mean, there are some changes, but it's a small sample. So I would say there's no systematic difference between slow and rapid onset disasters, with one exception. And the exception is that the image cultivation pathway is much stronger. Also the causative signal, but especially the image cultivation pathway, is much stronger in the sample of rapid onset disasters. And that's not really surprising, because if you think about when you read the news, what do you hear about? There's a big earthquake in Turkey and Syria. There's a big flood in Tunisia. There's a big this and this going on. So that's all rapid onset disasters. But you rarely heard news that this big drought in Somalia is now going on for the 22nd month. Because it's simply, there's one big earthquake, one big flood, all the houses are destroyed. It's one event, all the media rush in. There's a lot of, but these droughts are long-term events. They do not really produce spectacular pictures. So there's less attention to slow impact disasters or slow onset disasters usually. And less media attention usually means less incentives to change your strategies in order to communicate a message or portray an image or cultivate your image.
Thank you. We have
Well, thank you very much for your insightful presentation. I really enjoyed it. I have one question on your point of the importance of de-escalation using these insights. I understand that you are still, you have still ongoing research and you are analyzing the data, but if you have anything to share with us for how both researchers can look into it, or the practitioners can think about the potential for de-escalation with your insights. Thank you.
Hi. Yes, very happy to do that. So I think one of the, let's say, promising, and I wouldn't say that's like because my research is so amazing, that just happened to be the case, but it's obviously very nice. So um, so one of the good things really of the findings is that it matters a lot how disasters shape the power relations. If they benefit one conflict party over the other, we see conflict escalation. If they weaken both conflict parties, or if they weaken one and the other is already weakened, we are more likely to see a conflict de-escalation. Now, when working with regional organization, with embassies, with people on the ground, what I learned is that if you have conflict experts on the ground that know the conflict quite well, and that have informants. And I mean, there are people like that in every conflict situation. They can usually tell you very few weeks, 2-3 weeks after the disaster, how the disaster affected the conflict parties. And that's a big informational advantage, because if you get the information as a donor, as a foreign government, perhaps even at a national government, that the disaster strengthened one conflict party compared to the other, then you need to prepare for an escalation of the fighting, which means that if you want to deliver aid, you need to make negotiations with the government, with the rebels, to agree on safe delivery. You need to take additional measures to protect your humanitarian aid workers, because they might be under threat. It won't be very wise to start diplomatic negotiations, because usually diplomacy doesn't go well if fighting is escalated. However, if you receive the information that both parties are weakened by the disaster, there's a very reasonable chance you see a de-escalation of the fighting, which makes aid delivery safer, which perhaps makes it promising, because we know there's fantastic studies in conflict research that show that during periods of lower conflict intensity, mediation, peace negotiations are more successful. So that provides an opportunity to kickstart the debate. And I think the most well-known case for that is the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, and the impacts on the civil war in Aceh in Indonesia, where you had on both sides leaders willing to negotiate a peace, but they were too much under pressure from hardliners. Then you had the big tsunami, more than 100,000 people killed, both conflict parties tremendously weakened, a lot of international pressure to come to the table, allow safe aid delivery. That gave the upper side to those in the rebel leadership and in the government that sought peace. And then just 10 months, and it was heavily facilitated by the international community. 10 months later, you had a peace agreement, the Memorandum of Helsinki, September 2005. Conflict has been settled until now. It doesn't happen very often. It's the only case in the sample where you have this clear-cut example, but it shows there are opportunities. Even if the conflict de-escalation is short-term, there are opportunities.
Thank you. Those are really important takeaways for practitioners, mediators of conflicts. Thanks, Tobias. We have a question by our NERPS research fellow, Dr. Srinjoy Bose. I'm going to allow him to ask the question directly, and we'll see whether the audio in the room will be able to hear him. Okay, I'm now allowing you to talk, Srinjoy.
Hi, Dahlia. Can you hear me?
I think
Dahlia,
I
can you hear me?
You're not very loud, but I can hear you.
Okay, so my volume's on maximum. I'm afraid.
Alternatively, also Srinjoy kindly actually wrote the question in the Q&A box. So if that will not work, be happy to read his question.
Dahlia, why don't you go ahead and read the question if I'm
No.
not coming across well?
That obviously doesn't work. Sorry about that, Srinjoy, but I'll ask the question on your behalf. So Srinjoy is just thanking you for your insightful talk. He has read the IS article with keen interest, and he's looking forward to reading the book. But could you talk a little bit more about how rebel groups interact with indigenous and local knowledge? Your last slide touched on this a bit, but he'd like to understand a bit more about the structural and discursive issues that help illuminate why even localized rebel groups may not be able or unwilling to dialogue with indigenous and local knowledges? Thanks.
Oh man, you're asking tough questions. You better think about some easier questions when you're in Hiroshima next month, Srinjoy. I mean, to be honest, I haven't explicitly focused on indigenous groups, so I might speak more about local groups. Because yeah, I mean, indigenous is obviously another category. So I'm talking more about local groups, some of which are indigenous and some are not. So please bear with me for that. And especially in Nepal, you basically there are three approaches, and it really depends on patterns of territorial control and military strategy. So the first one is there are areas, especially in the high mountains, in the high altitudes, where the rebels are usually not active. So they don't have a connection to the local population, and they have very little knowledge of the ecosystem. So not only don't they really know how to deal with the disasters, but also they even have issues sustaining themselves. So I have tons of stories where people tried to cross high mountains, were surprised by snowstorms, and the locals saw the snowstorm coming early on. They, stored food, they moved down, and the rebels didn't and were surprised. And they didn't really know what to do because they just don't know the knowledge the local has. Because they are not active in the area, they have no ties to the population. And then the second approach is where the rebels actually have superior knowledge of than the local population. That usually happens, especially in Nepal, in the ecosystems and altitudes where the rebels are active, usually. So that's around in the 2,000 meter areas or in the plains, because they move around. So quite often they see where this bridge has been destroyed in the last monsoon, or this is how a landslide prone area looks, because even though it hasn't happened in that region, they have seen it in other regions. And sometimes they have engineers or qualified doctors with them who know a bit more about stability of bridges or epidemic risks. So sometimes they had better knowledge because they traveled beyond certain locations, they had seen more. But the dominant perspective really was that usually in the areas where the People's Liberation Army operated, they usually had a party presence. So they usually had one or two at least party members in the local community that served as their point of contact. And that would usually share the local knowledge or facilitate the sharing of local knowledge between the rebels. And this is a process that is not without frictions. For instance, there are cases where the rebels decided that based on their knowledge, this area is unsafe because it's landslide risk, flood risk, so they wanted to relocate the populations, but the population said, no, we lived here for so many years, nothing really bad happened, we don't want to relocate. So there had been a bit of tensions also sometimes in this relationship. So it's really very complex picture that defies a very easy that is how it is answer. I'm very sorry, Srinjoy.
Still very good question for difficult, a good answer for a difficult question, as you've said. Srinjoy will be ready to ask an easier question when he comes here in March.
I hope so.
All right, thank you, Srinjoy, and thanks, Tobias. We'll have one follow-up question from the floor, and a follow-up question from the floor, and then a new question also from the floor.
Yeah, Professor, I have a question regarding the data collection, the process of data collection. So like all the research, I assume that some of them was easy to collect, but some of them were really difficult to collect. So how would you know, for instance, in very remote areas that happened, I don't know, 30 years ago, how would you know that in particular this place there was disaster? Even because sometimes why I'm asking, sometimes even it happens in very remote areas, even the central government hardly can understand what happened there. So in this case, how would you know that in this year this disaster happened? Thank you.
All right. So the good thing is, and it's actually a bad thing, but it has advantages for research designs. Disasters are very big events that draw a lot of national and international attention. So usually, same for armed conflicts, by the way. So there is usually a lot of literature and media coverage on the disasters. Originally, I got the data from the emergency event database, the MDAT database in Belgium, which has a list of all major disasters, and also a lot of minor disasters. I mean, obviously they don't cover remote regions quite well and past periods quite well, but roughly from 1985, everything that was significantly large scale is very well covered by the database. So you get a lot of information indicators, and then you can use that, because if a disaster kills 1,000 people or more, in some cases 100,000 or more people, there's usually a lot of literature on it. There's usually a lot of media attention of it. There's usually internationals trying to rush in to provide aid. So there's a wealth of knowledge. I think there was one flood in India that I dropped from the sample because it was hard to find proper information on it, because the government didn't really allow a lot of access to the area. But and there are a few cases where I did interviews with local experts that were there at the time, because I felt there were knowledge gaps in the literature. But apart from that, actually, there's a lot written on these cases. A lot on the disasters and a lot of the conflicts. Not so much on the intersections, but hey, I need to do some work, so that's all right.
Thanks very much for your excellent presentation. I had a number of questions, but I think I'll have to limit myself just to one. Is there any ultimate kind of direction or pointer that we can draw from this study and from your own experience on, as the impacts of climate change, as they kick in, is there likely to be more intensifying of conflict, or do you think that that the world will kind of try to come together and try to face this try to face this as one? If I just think about the two case studies you spoke about, which was Sri Lanka and Pakistan, it seems that when you had two fairly equal sides who are equally strong, then there is opportunity for that to escalate further, for the conflict to escalate. But where you have two very unequal sides, then maybe the conflict may de-escalate, but it also mean that the weaker side, is worse off at the end of all of it. Thank you.
All right. So the power differential between the conflict sides in and by itself had no predictive power. So it was really how the disaster changed the power relations, not how the power relations were in absolute terms, but more in relative terms. Climate change is an excellent question. I mean, there's no difference in the results between climate-related and non-climate related disaster. The results are broadly similar. I checked that. Don't have a backup slide, but I checked that. So based on that, I assume that the picture will not much change on the climate change. We will see more disasters. We will see more disasters striking armed conflict zones that will lead to more cases where disasters contribute to an escalation of fighting, which is quite concerning. But it will equally lead to a larger number of cases where disasters contribute to a temporary 6 to 12 months de-escalation of fighting, which may or may not provide opportunities. The one thing that concerns me with climate change, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that concerns me with climate change, to be honest, but how it feeds into that picture here is that something that we can do at the moment is, if there's a big drought or flood in one area, usually governments, but also international actors have the resources, the funds, the food, the equipment, the personnel to send in and do disaster response, which not only sometimes helps with the de-escalation because it incentivizes cooperation, it reduces grievances, but which also improves the human security. If we are heading towards a 4, 5, 6 degrees warming world, we might not have this big drought in, say, Somalia, but we might have this big drought at the same time in Brazil, Ukraine, China, US, and Somalia. And that will make it much more expensive and much less likely that food, resources, personnel is brought in to deal with the case, or that we don't just have one big flood in Pakistan every 10 or 20 years, but every 2 or 3 years, which limits the capacity of the governments, but also of the rebels to deal with it, to provide relief. And that could, in a runaway climate change scenario, really be a major issue.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much for of course, the presentation and all your meaningful engagement with the ideas that Dr. Ide shared with us this morning. I wish we can have more time because I do acknowledge that there are some questions still left unanswered online, and we had received a pre-registration question, but unfortunately we ran out of time. Tobias has to catch a train to Tokyo to talk about climate security. We have 5 more minutes, but I think we'll end here. And this video is recorded and then will be published online via our YouTube channel, and then also we'll share the link to our through our social media accounts. I understand that there's some who would like to request the links for your book, so we'll also share that later through our website.
Yes, and drop me an email if you have urgent questions, or even better, come to the NERPS conference next month in Hiroshima and ask me the question in person. Unless it's very difficult, then not. Now that's all right. You can ask difficult questions.
Great segue, because our NERPS conference will be happening from March 6 to 9. Registration for non-presenting participants are still open until March 1. And then ahead of that, actually, we're going to have our NERPS special lecture on the environmental dimensions of peace building. So you're also invited. That will be in the same place, same time, but on February 16. Right. So thank you so much, our online participants, for tuning in, our on-site attendees for your participation and your question, and last but not the least, our special guest today. Thank you very much, Dr. Tobias Ide.
Thanks a lot for having me.